Okay, Christopher, you're up.
Right.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to begin by saying thank you. Thank you to the Heartland Institute. Thank you to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you to the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. And thank you also to the Europäisches Institut für Klima und Energie. All of them have contributed so much to this conference. And what a valuable conference it is. You look across the road and up at Le Bourget, the private airfield, where Mr. Gore's plane can fly in, his Gulfstream 5, I understand it was, one of the most CO2 emitting planes on the planet. That's how he arrived, to tell us we must live in poverty. Well, they have the money, the power, and the glory, but we here have the truth. So they have nothing, and we have everything. And in 50 years' time, when historians come to look back on this strange episode, this weird aberration, they will see that those who have gone in their tens of thousands to the other conference achieved nothing except the deaths of several tens of millions every year. And we have achieved everything by keeping the truth alive. You will have heard today from speaker after speaker, thoughtful, considered, carefully costed, mathematics and physics. You have not heard political propaganda. You have just heard straightforward science, straightforward economics, and straightforward common sense. Because we owe it to those less fortunate than ourselves that we should not indulge ourselves in bad science, bogus economics, but instead we should hold fast to the truth. There is no greater corruption than that form of corruption which tells lies and in doing so kills those who are most defenseless. Free speech is one of the casualties. You've all heard of Philippe Verdier, who was France's leading weatherman on the main TV channels. And shortly before the Paris conference, he was dismissed. Was it because he was a bad weatherman? If he was, of course, he could go straight to the Met Office and get a job. He was dismissed because he was a good weatherman, and he wrote a remarkably good book investigating whether we had a problem with the climate, as everyone was suggesting. Merely for asking that question, seeking the inconvenient truth, he was dismissed. But I am glad to report that he now has a job with Russia Today as a weatherman, where he will reach a far larger audience than ever he reached on French TV. Shall we give him a round of applause? He would have come to this conference had it not been for his new job. Now I'm going to start by looking at what we want from the Paris conference. And first of all, we would like to see, these are the full democratic provisions, I've listed them most carefully, that you will find in the draft Paris Agreement. It took me ages to type them all out. And it is dangerous when every time we establish among the nations a supranational and now increasingly a global body, we do not make sure that that body is elected by the peoples of the states parties to the treaty or agreement concerned. There are no democratic provisions of any kind anywhere in the 50 pages or so of mostly square brackets in this treaty draft. None whatsoever. And to those of us who were raised in freedom and were raised to love democracy and to be grateful to those who came before us and fought for it so that we could live in freedom, this is a grievous concern. So I raise it with you now because one of the things that we would like to see here in this conference is that if we are to have international agreements where real political power, decision-making power, legislative power, financial power and wealth are transferred from elected hands in those countries lucky enough to have them to unelected hands somewhere else, that's not acceptable. In future, such transfers must be from elected hands to elected hands, or there should be no transfers at all. Next, we want a secession clause. I'm glad to say that although this clause was not included in the first draft of February this year of the Paris Agreement, after a certain amount of manoeuvring round the back, we have managed to get a secession clause inserted into the second, third and now fourth drafts. It is still there in the current draft. I checked yesterday. And what it says is that at any time after 3 years from the date on which this agreement is entered into force for a party, that party may withdraw 1 year after having given notice to the depository state, which in this case is Paris. So this allows nations who gradually, one by one, realise, as Canada did under Stephen Harper, its late Prime Minister, that this climate scam is not a good idea. They can simply resile from the treaty process, as he resiled from the Kyoto Protocol, without any penalty whatsoever. Now that is a very essential clause because what it does is it prevents them from creating a permanent world government into which the member states are locked with no method of escape, even after it has become apparent to all of them that the proposition on the basis of which they agreed to this agreement was in fact largely fraudulent. So it gives them the right to escape, and that means that the bureaucracy at the centre of this will always know that if it pushes the truth too far in future, it will drive member states out of the agreement it has spent so much of its time and our money putting in place. We also would like to see a judicial inquiry clause. And the purpose of this clause is to make sure that the absence of debate, which is not our fault, but it is their fault, is remedied. One of the best ways of getting at the truth, even of a scientific question, where there is a dispute and where one side, knowing it is in the wrong, is reluctant to debate, is to say to both parties, put your best foot forward, we will invite testimony from all over the world, and at The Hague, you use the court there perhaps, and they say that on a certain date the hearings will begin. In the meantime, anyone who wants can submit evidence, and then they will be called and they can give testimony, but they will be cross-examined by the other side. We on this side of the debate are very willing to face such cross-examination because, as must be apparent to you by now from the very distinguished programme this morning and this afternoon, we on this side of the House have done our homework, we've done our maths, we know what we're talking about, and we're happy to defend it against cross-examination. But they are not. So let us have a judicial inquiry clause just to review whether or not these conferences are still going in the right direction, given some of the facts that you've already seen and some that I shall show you later on. We also want a sunset clause. And this simply says that if in any 20-year period over the 21st century there shall have been less than roughly 1/6 of a Celsius degree of warming, which is well below even the lowest amount that they're predicting, the entire ghastly process comes to an end, every body and structure created under that process comes to an end, and there will be no more of these dismal, miserable annual conferences. Are you all in agreement? What to do with the money instead? Well, you have heard 3 of the best presentations I have ever heard on the energy question. You've heard from Patrick Moore just how little the Greens would allow electricity to be generated at all. They seem to hate just about every form of electricity generation, and the only ones they seem to favour are the ones like wind that do the maximum environmental damage, and not merely just by destroying the landscape, but also by killing rare birds. This is a huge problem for us in Scotland. It's a huge problem in Spain, where campaigners have managed to get several large wind farms closed down before they killed all the rare birds in a particular region. And so that's a huge problem. But what to do with the money instead? Well, as you have heard particularly from Nick Lorris, we should spend the money on making sure that Africa, India, China and South America get electricity, and I mean baseload, continuous, reliable, cheap, coal-fired, clean electricity to every village and every home. We take this for granted, and it is not acceptable to us that these people should be told, well, as the professor of physics said to us when I attended a seminar at the mathematics department at my old university, Cambridge, just a couple of weeks ago, he said, we're going to give a solar panel and a battery to every hut in Africa so that they can read at night. Well, gee, wow, golly gosh, how patronizing is that, Professor? What we in this room would give them, and we'd be able to give it to them with a tiny fraction of the $1 billion a day now being squandered on using 14th century technology of windmills to address a 21st century non-problem. A tiny fraction of that expenditure, we could provide proper, continuous, baseload, affordable, coal-fired power to everywhere in Africa and China and South America and everywhere that hasn't got electricity. Because when you measure an opportunity loss, which is what this is in economic terms, in human lives, and not just a few, but in the tens of millions every year, that is how very serious this matter is. Why do I say tens of millions of lives every year? The life expectancy of the average person living in a country that doesn't have electricity for a general population is somewhere between 35 and 40 years. The average life expectancy of somebody in a country that does have electricity is between 85 and 90 years. So your lifespan is dramatically shortened if you don't have electricity. One of the pieces of research I'm going to do for my next scientific paper is just what is the cost in human lives of denying to the people of the dark continent, dark in every sense, just look at that map, the electricity that they need in order to live. But the opportunity loss isn't only in human lives. That, to any rational and humane person, would be enough. You heard Senator Inhofe in that brilliant presentation in which he packed so much into his 8 minutes. You heard him end by saying that we here are doing the Lord's work. We are doing the right thing by standing up and speaking out for those who don't have electricity. They don't also have clean water supply, because you need electricity to run the system. So we need to make sure that they have clean water supply. The planet is covered in water to a depth of several miles. It's not as though we're short of the stuff. It can be easily desalinated these days and pumped to where it's needed. And then we need clean sewerage for them to dispose of it safely when they've used it. They also need public health measures to control infectious disease. We have largely eradicated infectious disease as a killer in the West. It is still the biggest killer in the third world countries. And they also need education, because once they have education, they don't need to depend on us for any of these things, because they will be bright enough to do these for themselves. Those are the big needs. The UN knows they are the big needs. The UN has even costed what it would cost the planet to provide them with all those needs, all these basic requirements that we take for granted. And the cost of that, according to the UN, is $75 billion a year. But at the moment, the climate scam is costing the taxpayers of the West more like $1 billion a day, getting on for $400 billion a year. That money is being squandered on transferring wealth from the poor, as was said earlier, to the rich. It's supposed to be the other way around. The opportunity loss is worse than that too, because here are people who are struggling merely to survive from day to day. If they have to fetch water, they might have to walk half the day there to get it, half the day to get it back, just to give their children something to drink. These people could be doing productive work. just as we are fortunate to be able to do. All that is lost to the global economy. And let it not be thought that this is a problem which extends way beyond somewhere in the countries where we know nothing. Faraway countries of which we know little, as Chamberlain once said of Czechoslovakia. Goodness knows that was close enough to. And it's easy enough to say, well, Africa's a long way away and India's still further, and as for China, we've never really becoming prosperous like us. They will eventually begin to migrate. And most of them are young men in their 20s. They are economic migrants. They see our streets, compared with theirs, as paved with gold and not with mud. And these people desperately need the chance to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. The very fact that they are willing to dislocate themselves and travel so far and pay so much to the traffickers who ship them into Europe. The fact that they're willing to undergo the expense and the risk even to their lives to make that journey tells us all we need to know about how, if we wish to preserve our own prosperity, then it is time we looked a little more carefully at creating theirs. So we here at this conference speak for the poor people of the world. We speak for the huge economic opportunity that will accrue to the planet as a whole if we do what no previous generation could have done. And that is what the other conference at the private airfield should be doing. It should be saying that now for the first time we can eradicate poverty altogether from our planet. It no longer needs to exist anywhere. We know from our audits of natural resources, we know from the state of the climate, we know where we stand. We know that we can now eradicate poverty. Never again need anyone have to worry about where the next square meal is going to come from for himself or his children. We can do this. And yet, what do 147 heads of state and 195 negotiating parties do? They come together to talk about a non-problem. For there has been no global warming now for 18 years and 9 months, according to the RSS satellites. 18 years and 6 months, according to the UH satellites. On all measures, the rate of warming since 1990 is well below even the least prediction then made by the United Nations Climate Panel in its first report. We know now there are defects in their equations, we know now there are mistakes in their models, and even if they were right about the science, they're wrong about the economics. It costs 10 to 100 times more to try to mitigate global warming today than simply to adapt to its adverse consequences the day after tomorrow, even if they were going to be as bad as we were told, which we now know they are not. So yes, we are doing the Lord's work. We do speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. And it is we and our voice here, careful, respectful, well-researched, that will and must, for their sake, carry the day. God bless.
So we're going to have a 10-minute question period. If our speakers could come to the front and sit there. I don't know if Patrick is still here, but at least we have 3 seats. You know, it's interesting, if you have a look at this map, take a look at where the most light is coming from. It's South Africa. Okay, Al Gore was touring South Africa at the beginning of his 24 Hours of Reality, saying that their reliance on coal was a disaster. Well, actually, Africa has more than twice as much per capita electricity consumption than the next leading nation, and that's Egypt. Okay, and Africa, I should say South Africa, gets 95% of its electricity from coal. So that sounds like not much of a crisis to me. I mean, obviously, other nations should follow suit. So, if we have some questions, there you go.
I was at a conference with Christiana Figueres and Mary Nichols and Jerry Brown and a few others in California. It was called the Navigating an American Carbon World. And what they said back in 2013 was that the creme de la creme for them would be to put a single price on carbon. Where are they with that?
Shall I go?
Yep, you might as well,
Right.
you're the UN guy.
It should be a global tax, right?
Yes,
That would
it
be a
is.
global tax.
This was first proposed in the 2009 Copenhagen draft. It appeared again in the 2011 Durban draft and got dropped when I wrote a detailed expose on what was in that draft, and they dropped 2/3 of the text and it disappeared then. It's back again in the current draft, but not in a form which would be in any sense legally binding. They have found it very difficult, particularly because China has made it very, very clear, China for atavistic historical reasons, is not anxious to have any foreign power, however grand, having any direct control or policing of it and any direct imposition of regulation or taxation on it. That's why it blew the Copenhagen Agreement out of the water. And so, at the moment, they have not managed to get an agreement on whether there should be such a universal carbon tax, nor, of course, have they therefore agreed on what the rate of that tax should be. So I think it's a race from now on to see whether we can explain enough of the science and the economics to the world for them suddenly to realize that this is all going to go nowhere, or whether they can, through their control of the press, keep the facts from the people for long enough to allow them to get these mechanisms into place. But given all the previous attempts to set up carbon exchanges, for instance, that has also been a dismal failure. The cap and tax bill didn't go through in the United States. I think, frankly, that the days of any form of carbon taxation are probably numbered.
Tom, just a very brief comment on top of that. You say that the meeting you went to, they were discussing their wet dream instead of carbon tax. That's absolutely wrong. What they mean is a tax on carbon dioxide.
Right.
It's
Yes.
not a carbon tax.
Yes.
And by using their terminology, you get sucked right into the morass.
Yeah, actually,
Good
answering,
point.
one of the points that was brought up earlier is why have so many of the media not come here? And I think that part of it is because they have controlled the language. The environmental alarmists have controlled the language. They call it carbon pollution. Even in the Clean Power Bill, in the official government document, they call it carbon pollution. And of course, the whole idea, the deniers, that we are all the deniers, even though of course we're the opposite, we say climate always changes. So they have actually controlled the language. It's the weapon of war that is so effective that it keeps most of the climate reporters, they just stay away from our conferences. It's too frightening.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on this point, because Bob also has another part to it. He points out that there's the deliberate choice, so that people will tend to associate carbon dioxide with soot. And that's it. It's something like where carbon dioxide isn't. And as it did this morning at breakfast, I took a little bit of white chlorine and threw it over my shoulder, right? I mean, you can't just throw away these acids.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, and the media just exacerbates it by every story they do about this conference.
So, if we can
pictures
have
of China
political
and stuff.
correctness about, the correct name for a country and so forth, I say we should have political correctness about scientific terms. So whenever someone brings one of these things up, you touch
Stop
them
them right away.
and you hassle them about it until they accept it, and then you can move on to it.
Well, it would be like saying, I'm going for a glass of hydrogen.
Yeah, exactly.
Because just forget about the O on the, I mean, it makes no sense, so we should not call it
Properties
carbon.
are completely
And
different.
we should correct reporters when they ask us that question right away.
And we have to do it to economists too, because they're all sucked in.
Yeah.
Yeah, next question, yes.
My name is John Saul. I'm a geologist. I live here in Paris. My qualification is I've been a friend of Fred Singer's for a half century. And the other day I sent him the review and the talk about Philip Vergier's book and the scandal that he lost his job. And Fred emailed back saying he was going to be in Paris this week, going to be giving a talk. Be good to see me. So I paid him a visit yesterday afternoon, and he said, I'm giving a talk tomorrow morning. Do you want to come 10 o'clock? I said, fine. So I came at 10 to 10, and I asked if the front desk where Fred Singer was going to be giving a talk, and they said the Heartland something or other. I said, no, it's not a medical meeting. And so I found my way here. Now, one of the things I do professionally is I review applications to something called the DCO, Deep Carbon Observatory. They have $1 million applications. Most of the money comes from the Sloan Foundation. They've got big matching funds too. And it's to check where carbon's coming from and going to below us, not in the atmosphere, not in, but in the rocks, and in considerable depth. I've been reviewing proposals for them for about 5 years now, and something has emerged which is of general interest to you, I believe. We all have the general point of view that methane is coming from biological origin, degraded methane itself, or coming up from coal deposits or oil deposits. It no longer looks that way. It appears that the methane is coming from very great depths in the earth. It's being metabolized on its way up to the surface. And then what we're seeing at the surface is a biological product, but it didn't start as biology. It started as non-organic methane. And my feeling is that methane, natural gas, should be included amongst the renewable resources. I think it's going to be coming up forever and ever. And one of the most convincing bits of evidence is that you get oil fields with the oil at one level and the gas below it. It should really be the other way around if you give it any thought at all. And that's the point I wanted to bring to this meeting, and not knowing that I would be here.
Yeah, well, thank you. Did the panel have anything to comment on that?
I think the first thing I would say about the methane is it's very interesting that you think that this abiogenic methane is a more or less indefinitely renewable resource. I think that is a key insight for which I, for one, am very grateful. I shall try and capture you briefly afterwards to learn a bit more about it, if I may, but it's a very useful contribution to the debate. One thing one can say is that each successive report of the UN's climate panel, I'm just trying to find the slide here, and if we can get the thing lit up, I can show it to you. Here we are. Each successive report of the IPCC has greatly reduced its estimate of how much methane we are going to be emitting. It's going to warm up in a moment, is it? Well, I'll show you this because it's quite a spectacular graph. And when you see their predictions in each of the 4 successive reports, the first at the top, then the second, then the third, and then the fourth, reality is the black area at the bottom there. And you can see how, as with temperature, so with methane, they have flagrantly exaggerated the amount that gets into the atmosphere. And I suspect you might be able to help with this, that one of the reasons for this is that when it does get into the atmosphere, although while it is methane, it has 23 times the global warming potential molecule for molecule that CO2 has, it doesn't remain as methane in the atmosphere very long. It breaks down into CO2 and other compounds. Am I right about that?
That's correct.
Yes, very short lifetime.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very helpful, sir.
The next question is from Hans Lebon, who is one of our policy advisors at ICSC.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Hans Lebon. I'm from the Netherlands. I came this morning and I am again struck by the high quality of the speakers and the presentations. So I'm very satisfied that I took all the trouble to go along all those windmills to this beautiful place. Lord Monckton referred to bringing the discussion before the court, cross-examinations and so on. We in the Netherlands have some experience with the court. This is the first and the only court case on global warming or climate change in the world. And it was brought for the court by Agenda, which is a combination of urgency and agenda, which is led by a very adventurous and skillful lady, Marianne Minnesma, and she was a director of Greenpeace before she became the director of Agenda. And well, she did a tremendous job from her perspective, but not from the perspective of seeking the truth. Because a judge is not able to judge about a scientific problem. And the judges are influenced by the enormous propaganda wave. They are indoctrinated by so-called neutral information, media information about global warming over the last 20 years. And it is very unlikely that the judge will be able, given that enormous propaganda and indoctrination, that the judge will be able to judge such cases neutrally and objectively. Moreover, the court in question is some UN body, I suppose, the court in The Hague, something like it, and the UN is very good at influencing people, all kinds of people. Take for instance the oil industry. Why is the oil industry not dissociating itself from this UN nonsense on climate warming? It is not in their interest. Even Exxon has downplayed its position over the last few years. In the past, it was actually spearheading activities from the oil industry and other industry in order to counter the misinformation on global warming and climate change. Now it is not anymore.
So can, you wanted to address the...
If I may reply, maybe on
problem you bring up of judicial
Yes.
people not being
Yes.
actually able to judge.
I can give you a bit of a background on this. First of all, of course, we had a much earlier case on global warming, which was the Al Gore case in the High Court in London in 2007, which I engineered and also wrote the scientific testimony for. And until the scientific testimony reached the court, the first judge who heard the case threw it out on the ground that the IPCC must be right, confirming your view as to their inbuilt prejudice. But we then demanded and got a second judge because the first one had made the mistake of not even watching Gore's movie before deciding it was okay. So we had him removed and a new judge put in. The lawyers had never seen anyone do this before, but I gave them instructions on how to do it, and we actually got rid of the first judge and got a new judge. And the new judge, even though he had been a Labour candidate, even though he was sympathetic very much to the official point of view, when he was confronted with the scientific testimony, the other side were not able to refute it, and they climbed down rather than be exposed in court. And so we won that case, and we were paid $250,000 in expenses by the judge, which the government that we were opposing had to pay. So we can win these things. And of course, another point about the bias is that recently the Supreme Court, we have one in Britain now, held a meeting in courtrooms 1 and 2, which was broadcast on YouTube. It was a climate change propaganda event. Now that was a breach of the law because the courts have to be seen to be impartial, and they were plainly, again, as you rightly say, flagrantly biased. So what we're going to do about it is we've already sent in freedom of information requests, and we're gradually smoking out how it was that this propaganda event came to happen in the highest court in Britain. And the court is now in full retreat, and we are angling to get, and I think we will get, a day in court ourselves in front of the same judges to give the skeptical side of the case, and they will be required to broadcast that on YouTube just as they broadcast the other one. And we think that the lower courts will rather enjoy ordering the higher court that it should do that. But to finally wrap this up, the reason why I suggest not a court case but a judicial inquiry is that that is of a different character. You do not have parties immediately struggling for a particular event. You have a complete review of all evidence that anyone wishes to put in by barristers on both sides employed by the court, and then it all goes to the judges who will then hear evidence from all parties. This can go on for months. And if in that environment we can't win, then we don't deserve to. I think we can, and I think we should.
Do you think we can win in a court like in The Hague?
Yes, we can. It doesn't matter how influential the UN thinks it is. The one thing the other side are terrified of is a genuinely adversarial case. Who was our agenda going against? I can't remember.
Sorry.
Who was the other side in the agenda case?
Actually, it was against government.
That's the point.
The point is...
That it was a sweetheart action. And we've had one other, there was Massachusetts v. EPA in the United States. A sweetheart action is an action where both sides actually want the same objective, but one side says it doesn't. They then go to the court and end up agreeing that whatever they wanted in the first place is the outcome. The court then lends its blessing to the Massachusetts action, was certainly a sweetheart case. And the only adversarial case that I've been involved in, certainly, is the one against Al Gore's movie, which we won hands down. I mean, the judge ended up saying the Armageddon scenario that Gore depicts is not based on any scientific view. That's how far he went.
Can I add to your second point, to shift gears a little bit about why big businesses support these initiatives? I think there's three very clear reasons. One, they think it's better to have a seat at the table than be left out in the cold. Two, they want some type of international commitment, so the businesses aren't going away from the United States to China, so they want China and India to play ball, even though that won't be the case. And three, I think big businesses are the most cronyist of them all. And so they can work with politicians and lobbyists and pass the costs on to consumers and squeeze out the smaller businesses who can't afford to take on these regulations. It squeezes out the competition for them.
So we have time for
Four is extortion.
And
we have time for just one short question. Well, he just gave one. Why don't you talk to them more?
I have to follow up.
Does anyone else want to ask one?
Yeah, is there anyone else? Okay, well, why don't we share, I'll pass it over to Jim, and if you want to discuss further, of course, they're right here, and you can talk to them later.
Actually, there's one more question, it's one from online, I think.
Yes, okay.
I'm going to kind of paraphrase it, because it's, he says here, it says from someone named Stu Green, surely all those big government institutions can't all be wrong. There's so many of them, they host many scientists and events and get together and stuff, so surely it must be the skeptics, us, that are wrong. But I think what he's getting at is that, I don't know if you can, I don't like going into motivations of other people, but these are learned men, these are men and women, these are scientists, they're scientific training.
Wolfgang.
And they come to completely different conclusions. Why?
Wolfgang, you're going to do
Okay,
this
go
one?
I mean, the point is like, some people are independent, some people have the courage. I mean, take me. I mean, I left the foundation job, which I like, not because I hated it, but because I want to be even more independent. And when I see now my old colleagues who seriously are afraid to talk at our Essen conference this week on the 11th, 12th December, and really adding, saying, oh, we even get a second child. So basically, I don't want to lose my job.
That's true.
And this is definitely both people are afraid of. And remember Nir Shavif? He said in public a few times at a conference that I recommend my students, in case they want to go for an academic career, not to do the same what I do. So I mean, for me, this is like kind of enough evidence to say, if you only speak out if you're really independent or don't care.
I just want to say that that's what academic tenure is for.
Yes, indeed it is. I gave a seminar for a climate change student in New Zealand a couple of years ago at the request of her uncle who knew me. And I sat her down and said, we're going to do the fundamental equation of climate sensitivity. I nearly gave it to all of you today, so you'd be grateful that I didn't. And I took her through the math. And I said, here's how it works, here are where the strengths are, here are where the weaknesses are, here's why, in the end, it's wrong. And at the end of that hour, she said, I have just learnt more about the fundamental physics of global warming than I have learnt in 3 years at university. And I stopped her there. I said, don't get excited. If you breathe a word of this in any of your term papers or your exam paper, they will fail you. I said, don't go there. This is a reign of terror now, where only one side is permitted, and the reason why we who speak out are so vilified is that this is an ancient technique not to frighten us, but to frighten anybody else who might otherwise speak up alongside us. That's the way these governments and these scientific associations have managed to frighten anybody into silence who would otherwise tell the truth.
And
The
they
fact is, they are wrong, we are right, Stu, so get used to it, mate.
Yeah, and there are a number of scientists who've had death threats and being chased completely out of the field.
Yes.
I mean, it's really pretty nasty.
And also, big government sets the policy objective before the research is even being done. So there's a self-selection bias to find those researchers. They're going to be paid for with big government dollars, and then they have the biased outcome that they want, and then it makes it all that more difficult to speak up with truth and dissent.
And besides, even if there were a unanimous consensus, as there was as to the appropriateness of Newton's laws of celestial mechanics for 300 years, all it takes is one patent clerk, third class, in an obscure patent office in Switzerland to write a single paper and to show all 300 years worth of them that that consensus was wrong. Now, I'm no Einstein, but I can assure you that the notion that merely because there is a consensus is that we should believe what the consensus says is an ancient logical fallacy, the fallacy of head count. It's excoriated as such and identified as such by Aristotle 2,350 years ago in his refutations of the sophists. It has absolutely no place in science. Science is a process of inquiry and not of belief.